Well, it's interesting because again, we're really approaching things from a mindfulness perspective, but I would call what you're describing as for some people an experiment that they could conduct on themselves to see how their body responds. So for me personally, so my big activities are hiking. I live in beautiful Phoenix where we have tons of urban hiking trails. And I
Camelback
also
Camelback Mountain.
Camelback. I actually happen to live near South Mountain. We have just hundreds of miles of trails, one that's just 5 minutes from my home. So really lucky to be able to hike when I want. Now in the summertime, obviously it's up early to be able to do it. So I never eat before I hike. I also happen to be a yoga instructor, and although mostly I take classes rather than teach classes, I find that if I do an early morning class, I feel much better if I don't eat. If I am going to teach a class mid to late morning, that's probably not a good idea. So for me personally, it's really about experimentation. Now to get back to the issue of hunger, a lot of the people that I work with will say one of two things. One is they'll say, "Well, I'm never hungry." And I think what often is going on for people is they're eating for so many other reasons that their body never needs to tell them that they need fuel. So, this idea of intermittent fasting that you're describing could be really helpful for somebody to check in to say, okay, what does hunger really feel like? We often hear this rule about don't let yourself get hungry. And I really disagree with that rule. I think it's important to allow your body to reach a point where it actually needs fuel. I think the rule is meant to be don't let yourself get too hungry because certainly hunger isn't yes or no. Hunger falls on a gradation. We teach a hunger and fullness scale that goes from 1 to 10. So 5 is neutral, 1 is so famished you'll eat the chair that you're sitting on, and 10 is so full you feel like you're going to explode. So when people are a little bit hungry, a 4 or a 3, then they are much more in charge of the decisions they make about what they're going to eat. If they allow themselves to get all the way to a 1 where they're starving, now they're hypoglycemic. And as you know, your brain primarily functions best on glucose. And so if you haven't eaten anything for such a prolonged period of time that you're not thinking clearly or making great decisions, then all the plans that you had for making healthy choices end up being much more difficult to follow because now you're operating on starvation mode. So I love the idea of experimenting and noticing, okay, what does true hunger feel like? And getting used to noticing those symptoms before they're so extreme that I'm not really making good decisions anymore. The other thing that people will sometimes say is, I'm hungry all the time. You explained one possible reason for that with the physiology of taking in carbohydrates and up and down and up and down. But the other reason that people will say that they're hungry all the time is that they're really confusing wanting to eat with needing to eat. So again, a process of intermittent fasting might help them reconnect with that awareness of the difference between wanting and needing. And I think that's an important distinction in a food abundant culture that we live in right now.
I couldn't agree more because that is really the nail on the head is that almost everyone listening to this or watching this has access to food 24/7, and that really was
Absolutely.
not the historical precedent. I mean, we
Hmm.
went through periods where we didn't have access to food. So it would it as a physician, I'm sure you would agree that it would probably make sense to emulate our historical patterns. So it probably is healthy to go fasting occasionally. But the point I wanted to make though is with this intermittent fasting, I think people who haven't fat adapted are far more likely to go to the extremes of the scale that you mentioned, that to be really ravenously hungry and make poor choices because they're still in the wrong metabolic mode. They're burning carbs and not the fat. So, but once they've shifted, it's a 2 or 3 week process to do that. Then when they go through that, then they don't go to the extremes and they can make the healthy choices. But I think there's a bit of a danger to participate or try intermittent fasting unless you've made that transition, because it could really get you to the extremes and cause you to make some poor choices.
Mm, right. And I think, what I use to help people get back into this place of awareness is something I call a mindful eating cycle. And what we're really doing with the mindful eating cycle is examining each of the decisions that we make around eating. So it can be very overwhelming for somebody who's been struggling with food or weight or eating or body image issues because there's so much information out there, when in fact, most of that information can be put into six categories. In order in the cycle, up at 12 o'clock, I have people focus on why. Why am I eating in the first place? The second decision at 2 o'clock, if we're moving around the face of a clock in a cycle, would be when. When do I feel like eating? Am I actually hungry, or am I eating for other reasons or feeling like eating for other reasons? Time of day, for example. The next decision after I decide to eat is what do I eat down there at 4 o'clock? So, what am I going to eat? And that in that decision, I think is it really ties into a lot of the messages that you share with people about really understanding what's in your food, number one, and number two, how does it affect you? And what I try to do is make the link between knowledge and experience so that as people become more mindful, they start to notice that indeed this knowledge actually shows up in my body in certain ways. I feel a certain way when I make those decisions. So they're much more likely to make those decisions in a sustainable fashion rather than just following some external rule when they've experienced it for themselves, as you're describing. The next decision point down at 6 o'clock, if we're moving around the cycle, after you've chosen your food, is how do I eat that food? How? So, how I eat food is really related to paying full attention to the eating experience, because the other challenge for people is that they may say, oh, I love to eat, or they may say, oh, I struggle with my weight, I need to figure out what to eat. But for a lot of people, again, especially in our abundant food culture, they're very distracted while they eat. So they don't notice the flavors and the tastes and the aromas and the textures of their food. And they aren't really aware of the physiological signals that are telling them how the food is affecting them and when they've had enough. So they again check out during eating, watching TV or reading or working or driving or many other activities that don't allow us to fully engage in the eating process. We know that satiety is not just physical fullness. It also comes from enjoyment of food and from the entire eating experience. So when people can learn how to eat by slowing down, setting their fork down between bites, really chewing and savoring their food, not counting the number of chews, but really savoring the nuances, the flavors and aromas of their food, it becomes a much more enjoyable and satisfying eating experience so they can stop. Which leads us to the next decision point there at about 8 o'clock. How much do I eat? So, how much I eat is really determined by what my true needs are. And again, people have gotten so disconnected from what their true needs are. They eat what's on their plate or in the package or what other people are eating, when, as you well know, most of the time those portion sizes are way out of line with what our true needs are, especially since so many people are sedentary. And then last but not least, at 10 o'clock in the mindful eating cycle is where do I invest the energy? Where do I invest the energy that I've consumed? And I think one important piece of this is exercise, but where also has to do with the other things that I do day to day, how I move throughout my life, how I spend my time, what I do at work. And again, in our current culture, we are living such a different life than we were designed to live. Much more sedentary, much we don't have to chase our food down or dig it up or find it. It's just there, just sitting there. So we really end up in this calorie imbalance, not just because we are eating the wrong foods, but because oftentimes we're disconnected from what our true needs are. So I think that mindful eating cycle can give people a path to follow to help them increase their awareness about all the complex decisions that go into eating and energy balance.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I'd like to comment on the 4 o'clock part of the cycle, which is choosing the right foods. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure what position you believe or what your position is on what the cause is of the obesity epidemic. Obviously, we have one. Literally 2 out of 3 people in the country are not at their ideal body weight. So there's got to be some reason because this has not been the pattern for
Hmm.
a long time. It's a relatively recent observation and experience. So it seems to me that there's some very compelling evidence that the primary issue is the consumption of fructose. And it's not really rocket science to figure it out if the number one, the absolute highest source of calories in the entire country is fructose. So it wouldn't be too much of a leap to believe and understand that that has to have something to do with it. So my concern is that you could have an Olympic, you could be an Olympic medal in mindfulness, gold medal Olympic mindfulness person, but if you're still consuming significant amounts of fructose, your physiology and biochemistry is going to be so screwed up that if you have some tendencies towards gaining weight anyway, you're just not going to be successful no matter how many of these mindfulness techniques you apply. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think it's an interesting perspective, and I think that all of the aspects of the decision points that go into eating contribute. I think it's way too simplistic. This is my opinion. I think it's way too simplistic to hang any problems on one single issue. I think that most people would agree that in addition to the abundance of food, I think people are under a lot more stress. There's so many complex issues, and I think they all play together. And I think why I have chosen to really focus on mindfulness as a solution to this is that as people become reconnected, become more aware of that mind body connection, they begin to naturally make adjustments in their eating. So for me, I don't need to tell somebody, oh, don't eat this, don't eat that. In fact, my personal philosophy on nutrition is that all foods can fit into a healthy diet, but we've lost that sensibility of balance, variety, and moderation. And what you're describing is really this sort of system gone awry where there is a lack of balance and moderation. So when I show people the tools for becoming more aware of how things affect them, they naturally begin to gravitate toward healthier eating and increased physical activity. In one retrospective analysis that we did of 229 people that had been through our workshops, 83% of people said that they were eating healthier at the end than at the beginning, even though we didn't teach them rules. We gave them information, but we didn't tell them what they could or couldn't do. So it's really interesting to me that as people become more connected, they start to discover how they feel when they eat too much sugar or too many carbohydrates or don't eat in a balanced pattern that serves their fuel needs. So whatever the underlying issues are for one individual person, mindfulness is one tool that they can use to begin to get back into balance. And again, I think this sort of reflects the difference between some of the people you may be working with and some of the people I may be working with, because we're really working with people who have tried everything to lose weight. And I think absolutely there are lots of different strategies they could use, but the common denominator for many of them is that they are not eating according to their body's needs. They're really eating more often for environmental and emotional triggers. And the more we can help them become aware of that and develop new strategies, the more they begin to seek a more balanced diet. And I'll if I could just to expound on that and why we think that happens is that if I'm eating because I'm sad, mad, glad, stressed, bored, or lonely, I may be far more likely to seek out foods that are going to be convenient and calorically dense and give me that little energy lift and pleasure. When I'm eating because I'm physically hungry and I'm fueling my body for my day or my yoga class or to be able to get a good productive a few hours in at my desk, then I'm much more likely to reach for foods that are going to give me that kind of energy. So as I become more aware of the real reasons that I eat, then I begin to make choices that meet my needs and my goals for how I